everybody, welcome to Vessels of King's Graves, Agatha Christie Reread. This is episode 24. My name is Bina007, and I'll be your host today, along with
2.0, also known as Pat.
Hi, Pat. And today we are covering another Hercules Poirot mystery. We've had a run of them, and this one is Appointment with Death, originally published in 1938 on the eve of World War II. So, Pat, is this one of your favorite Agatha Christie novels? Where would this rank amongst your favorites or least favorite novels?
It's not as good as some of the others. I would rank this mid tier. I think it has some problems which we'll probably get into, and I think overall it's just because I found the cast of characters were less interesting to read as some of the other ones. So
yes, and this is, it's worth saying to the listener that we will be spoiler free until the end credit music, and then we'll get into spoilers afterwards. But this is very much a character driven mystery. It's all set in and around this one family of rich Americans that are traveling through the Middle East. And a lot of the drama and tension is around the relationships between them. So if you don't think they're authentic and fascinating as characters, that is going to be a problem. It sounds like I'm going to like this more than you. So this could be quite an interesting discussion, because I really love psychological thrillers. And I find this is more one of those almost than a murder mystery. And I love the setting. I love the setting of Jerusalem and Petra. I've actually been to Petra, which was in my original phase of reading Agatha Christie in my early 20s. Very much inspired by this book. And I think it's one of the most amazing places on earth. So it sounds like I probably like this a little bit more than you, but we'll get into it. So let's set up the story for people who, I hope you've all read it, guys, because we are going to eventually spoil it. But if you haven't, let's lure you in. So in this novel, Hercule Poirot is once again on one of his very exotic holidays. And on his travels, he meets a very interesting, well, maybe not a very interesting family. We'll find out from Pat in due course. There is the mother, who is very controlling, called Mrs. Boynton. Obviously very rich, very obese. I'm not sure it's very politically incorrect the way that Agatha Christie describes her nowadays. And she has got children. So she married or had a marriage late in life. She has got Raymond Boynton, her stepson, Carol Boynton, who is the stepdaughter, Lennox Boynton, another stepson, his wife Nadine, and then there's also her actual daughter or biological daughter with her husband Ginevra, who's the youngest of the children. And then hanging around this family is also a guy called Jefferson Cope, who we will discover was an old flame of Nadine and thinks she's married badly and is sort of there as a sort of white knight to come and rescue her. There's also on their travels Dr. Gerard, who's a very charming and quite famous, apparently, French psychologist, and who is fascinated by this family, particularly the control that Mrs. Boynton seems to have on her children, and the fact that they don't really, even though they're sort of, in their 20s or 30s, they don't seem to be able to do anything or talk to anyone without her permission. And there's also a young female doctor, Sarah King, who's just graduated. She's come out of a bad relationship and kind of just picks a place on a map to go and visit. She's heard of Dr. Gerard. They strike up a friendship. And she's also fascinated by this family and wants to, I guess, finds her pride piqued by the fact that one of the young men obviously quite likes her, but won't talk to her because of the mum. So I think she finds that she's up in a battle of wills with the mother. But yes, she is a professional woman. And as we go on our travels from Jerusalem to Petra, we also come across another traveller called Lady Westholme, who is a member of Parliament. She is probably modelled on Lady Astor, who married an American who married into the British aristocracy and went into Parliament. Very fierce lady, goes around doing all sorts of important things like reforming politics. And she's got a companion called Miss Pearce, who's rather weak and weedy and sort of follows her around a little bit like a lapdog. So that's sort of the main cast of characters. And I guess the only extra person in there is Colonel Carberry, who is a senior figure in the Emirate of Transjordan. And when a murder occurs, he's going to be the guy who's investigating it and who brings Hercule Poirot in to help him out. Anything else you want to say about the characters or maybe the setting of the novel? Maybe before we get into the characters?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too sidetracked on the setting, but I did find that one of the more interesting aspects of this book. So I think from what I've read around, we're dealing with quite a small slice of history, because the Emirate of Transjordan was not a long-lived emirate. This is sort of like in the window just before the Second World War, but it's just after sort of Lawrence of Arabia has helped the Middle East sort of throw off the Turkish Empire. So the British are in there really as a result of what happened with Lawrence of Arabia and the Arab uprising. So I found it quite interesting to get that insight. And I think Colonel Race gets mentioned, doesn't he?
Absolutely. So Colonel Carberry is someone who knows Colonel Race, and that's how he kind of gets to know Hercule Poirot, basically.
When we talk about not really knowing what Colonel Race does, he just travels internationally fixing things for the Empire. You get the feeling that Carberry is part of this same setup, and I think what was also quite interesting is that it's very much a portrayal of how Britain saw itself overseas at the time, and it wasn't really a representation of how things, I think, really stood. I think the British grasp on the world and its empire was much looser, and it was far weaker than it was representing. I mean, which you would, if you look back in the history books, you'd see at the start of the Second World War, where it was very much put on the back foot. So, again, like, I know it's only fiction, but this is sort of like the world of the English patient, the film and the book as well, where Britain is almost losing its grip on this area of the world. And I thought that was just, it was quite interesting to get another insight into it, another view of it, how this all operated. I'm not studied it in any detail, but this was obviously the way it was run. Carberry was in there effectively, running this Emirate of Transjordan because he had the military power backing him up.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's a great insight, because that is part of the reason why I find it fascinating reading these books, because you almost get a sense, even from, I mean, if this Transjordan Emirate it was alive from 1921 through 46, so it really is a creature, as you say, of those post-World War I peace treaties and then up to the end of World War II, when I guess is when you get Jordan, or the both sides of the sort of the water united in making Jordan. But this
is also like you see it alluded to in the book, and it comes up in a couple of the adaptations as well. There is actually talk of the Jews coming back to this part of the world, and you get that already the start of the simmering tension. There's a couple of bits later on where one of the Arab tour guides, like, it's always mentioned in the background, he was voicing it, his displeasure at the Jews. He was cursing the Jews. It's bubbling on in the background, and you can see already Christie's talking about the simmering tensions that we still got today in the Middle East. It's there. So
absolutely, and you can see that kind of, as you say, the idea that the British kind of peak of its imperial power was almost well before this, that we're almost still already in the declining period. And of course, with World War II and the sort of effective bankruptcy of Britain, it's going to go into overdrive in the aftermath. But this idea that actually the people who are really traveling and who have all the money are the rich Americans, and it's a very international crowd. But it is interesting to me that this isn't a British family. And Sarah King is the lone Brit in the cast, actually, really, apart from Colonel Carberry. That this is a playground for other people to travel in. But it also struck me as kind of interesting, because she was presumably writing this in 1937, and we know that because she was then married to Max Mallowan, the architect, that on the eve of war, and a war that is going to encompass the Middle East, that it obviously was still perceived to be safe to travel in this region, which kind of surprised me. And also, even though they're traveling in some luxury, right, especially when they're in Jerusalem in this like very lavish hotel, that you would then go into Jordan or Transjordan to Petra, and having done that journey in sort of more modern times, it is more rickety. But this idea that even in great luxury, that you would have to go on sort of donkey and stay in tents or in the cave, like that's your choice.
The point I was going to make as well, which I think touches on what you've just saying, and particularly following on from having done Death on the Nile recently as well, is I get the feeling that if you had the money at the time, travel was actually much easier to these locations than it would be now, because as a Western European, there's much more danger involved in traveling to some of these locations. Like, certainly, I don't think I'd feel safe traveling to Egypt at the moment.
Yeah.
So like I get the feeling reading this that Christie had an opportunity to see a lot of stuff that even if I had money, I probably might not get the opportunity to see now. Particularly with this trilogy of novels that we're looking at the moment, with having done Murder in Mesopotamia,
And Death on the Nile. Yes.
Death on the Nile. So she's travelled through Iran, Egypt. She's now in what's modern day Israel and Jordan, and I think I would be spending a very long time in customs if I followed that same itinerary now, explaining to people at the border why I'm traveling to these various locations.
Because
unless you had
in a way, I mean, that was the power of the old navy blue British passport in that period, that you were afforded certain rights to travel, a certain arrogance of being able to travel. I think you pick up on that a little bit in the character of Lady Westholme as well, who's meant to be this very intrepid woman who thinks nothing of just clambering onto a camel and poking her nose into how the Bedouin are running this or how that person is running that, and just basically has this sense of entitlement and privilege that she will naturally know how to organize stuff better. And, with the kind of the arrogance of the British Empire, the kind of the money of being American and rich, the arrogance of maybe being a sitting member of parliament. I mean, my goodness, the world is open before her. But even, like the idea that Sarah King is a single woman traveling in the late 1930s. She's just newly qualified as a doctor. And she feels like there's never a moment when she says, gosh, I'm booking this travel to Petra on my own in a group of people traveling that I've never met before, in tents and on camels and horseback. I mean, it just feels, I think we're meant to admire her for being like having a lot of pluck, but it doesn't feel like this is something that would be unsafe or uninsurable, which as you say now, I think,
I had not even considered the travel insurance point of view, but yes, it would possibly be uninsurable. Like you get your world travel insurance, and they turn around and say, yeah, but we're going to exclude this trip to this location and this trip to this location because they're just too dangerous. So
I mean, I have to say, I literally have done the trip that they did, so the Jerusalem, then into Amman in Jordan, down to Petra. And it is quite a touristy thing to do. And there are like touristy hotels and all of those places, and it's all very well organized. So if anyone is thinking of doing it, I would really encourage them to do so. But certainly when you're in Jerusalem, you're very aware of the heightened security risks that people living there endure day by day. Jordan actually felt very safe, and so did Petra. Certainly more so than going to other parts of the Middle East, and maybe even Egypt now. But I think in this era, for sure, it's very much underwritten by the empire, isn't it? The Colonel Carberries of this world are going to fundamentally keep you safe.
Well, I think what it is that the area it's always unstable because of the different competing tensions, and what you do is you get windows of opportunity where it's more safe and more peaceful and more relaxed, and you have to take those opportunities when they come, and this was one of those windows. This Emirate of Transjordan was a window of opportunity. Like you said, you can travel to Jordan now. It's relatively safe, but with the simmering tensions in that area, it might not be.
Oh, well, shall we get into the murder? So the murder victim in this book is Mrs. Boynton, the domineering mother of the family. And what's confusing about this murder is that really all of the children in their own way probably have a motive to kill her, because they're financially dependent on her and she's making their life very controlling. I think that there's a real danger that if Lennox feels that if he didn't murder his mum, his wife Nadine might leave him, for example. So there's a lot of motive to kill this woman who we're meant to see, I think, through Agatha Christie, that she really is a very poisonous individual. And the way in which she's murdered is that she's been given a hypodermic syringe that contains a poison digitoxin, but it's something that she was taking medicinally every night in solution at lower dosage. So ultimately, if it weren't for the little hypodermic syringe mark on her wrist, you might have thought she'd just taken an accidental overdose. So that's the sort of the first point of the murder. And actually, Colonel Carberry could have overlooked that, or could have just said, well, it's just an unfortunate coincidence. But something about him just doesn't strike or rubs him up the wrong way. And he calls in Hercules Poirot, who basically just talks to all the people who are around on the trip. so the family members, Lady Westholme, Miss Pierce, Dr. Gerard, Sarah King, and just tries to ascertain from their stories what he thinks happened, and he gives himself a time frame against which he's going to do this. So it's almost like he's gamifying it for himself. So that is the murder. I'm trying to think, is there much else we can say without getting into spoilers?
For me, this book broke down into sort of three broad sections quite easily. And we've got the sort of the introduction where we meet the cast of characters.
Yeah, so mostly the sort of Jerusalem section where you're seeing all the interactions, I guess, and then
which I found really difficult reading because I just couldn't buy into some of these characters. I think it was maybe my problem because I was frustrated reading about how these characters were controlled, and I don't think maybe Christie had done enough to convince me about this romantic attachment that Sarah King and Raymond Boynton had developed. I just wasn't buying into it. So, and I think
so the way I bought into that was like a clash of wills. So I totally believed the idea that this egomaniacal mum could have such power over the children. And I think it's interesting that Agatha Christie did model this family on a family that she met on her travels. And I think maybe, I'm going to say something horrific now, maybe borderline racist, maybe coming from an Asian family where you do have these incredibly controlling mothers of their sons and therefore the daughter-in-laws. It's like a trope in Asian drama. I've kind of seen this happen. So to me, that felt so credible and believable.
It wasn't so much that I didn't find that whole aspect believable. I think it was more that I was like, how is Sarah King, this young professional woman with all these talents, who's incredibly attractive, suddenly latched onto Raymond Boynton? And you're like, I didn't get it. I think
the way to get it is more, because I think actually she's rather attracted to Dr. Gerard, who I think certainly attracted to her, even though she's much younger, because he is the flair, he's the wisdom, he's got all the charm and the wit.
And again, I don't want to necessarily speak out of turn, but I think that's maybe something that's maybe not translated as well. If I'd been reading this in the 30s with all my sensibilities back then, as opposed to reading it now, I might have bought into that a bit more. But again, I found it a bit creepy. I was like, how old is this Dr. Gerard? There seems to be a significant age difference.
Yeah, absolutely. But that I found more plausible, the idea that she would be sort of like attracted to him. But I agree that it is a bit kind of bizarre that she would find this kind of wet and sort of like flimsy Raymond, who's just, absolutely constrained by his mother, remotely attractive. But the way I looked at it was more just it's more that her ego and her pride has been piqued. Like we're made to know that she is quite attractive. She's used to having male attention, Sarah King. And she probably takes it as her due that someone would find her attractive, like Raymond. And then when that guy, like a bit like a yo-yo, is kind of snatched back by his mum and the string is pulled in, I think it's more, not so much that she wants Raymond, but that she doesn't like the idea that another woman would have taken him away from her. So I don't really believe in the romance between the two of them. To me, it's definitely a clash of wills because she's strong-willed and Mrs. Boynton's strong-willed. And so Raymond is just kind of like this pathetic little, I sound very pathetic, but it's just kind of like the collateral damage to their and maybe I'm reading too much into it and giving Agatha Christie too much of a free pass in that. I don't know.
Well, I think that's part of all storytelling, and I think that's why some people like stories and other people don't enjoy them. And it's a degree of your buy-in, and some of that comes with your background and your knowledge and what you've got, and it means that some things are implausible for some people, whereas some people just skate over them. But anyway, I find it difficult to buy into that. The second part, which I did enjoy a bit more, was the trip to Petra and the murder. And when I was reading that, it was a travelogue and it was quite interesting to get this peek into what was going on in Petra. But I found it very macabre. It was almost like a gothic horror, and I enjoyed some of the descriptions. Particularly of Mrs. Boynton. There's a great one.
Absolutely.
Where Sarah King is like, Sarah King I got this quote. Sarah stared up at one of the caves. It held a sitting figure. What was it? An idol? A gigantic squatting image? No, that was flickering lights that made it loom so large. It must be an idol of some kind. Sitting there, unmovable, brooding over the place. Then suddenly her heart gave a leap of recognition. Gone was the feeling of peace and escape the desert had given her. She'd been led from freedom back into captivity. She'd ridden down into this dark, winding valley, and like an archpriestess of some dark, forgotten cult, like a monstrous swollen female Buddha sat Mrs. Boynton. And as I was reading that, it was reminding me a lot of things like Lovecraft and Poe. I was like, my God, this is quite dark. It was almost like a horror. So I thought that was quite good. I enjoyed that section.
Yeah, I think you're right. That is the strongest section, partly because you feel the authenticity that Christie has done this journey. She captures exactly the landscape. And it is a spooky place to go to even now, because you just go through this totally barren, rocky, crevice-filled landscape, and you kind of descend deeper and deeper into the cracks, and
You're
suddenly
getting almost a glimpse into an ancient world that we only really we're piecing together, but we're never going to have the full picture of how it operated. There's something mysterious about it.
Yeah, and no one really knows why that civilization ended. It's kind of a mystery. It's sort of this weird, and it's this huge kind of ancient city, or megapolis, and it's sort of, it is really claustrophobic because you are in it looking up, and it's very high and etched into the rock, and it is very eerie and sinister, and you don't know why it vanished. And I think she just captures something brilliant. And I think the character of Mrs. Boynton, the idea of this person who is sort of almost immobile in her obesity and physically just sort of oppressive, but all the evil is through the mind. Her control over her children is entirely psychological, and from a younger age, so that, with one word she can snap them back. I think you're right. I think some of the best Agatha Christie is the kind of the horrific Christie. And I think we'll get there also with And Then There Were None. Like, it's a very, very horrifying, I find it quite a scary book. And I think she does that really well.
Yeah, it reminded me a bit of Lovecraft when she was talking about this ancient civilization and this figure sitting in it. I thought, oh, wow, this is super, super spooky. I thought that was great. And then obviously, like, the third part is when Poirot turns up and is, conducting his investigation. And I just thought that was great. That was just like classic Poirot and classic Christie. He's been locked in a small group of people, and he's working out who's done the murder. And that was fine. But it was just having the stamina to overcome that initial part, where I'm watching the interaction between the Boyntons and Dr. Sarah King, and it was a bit of a yawn fest, because I wasn't buying into the Boynton kids. They were just annoying me.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's going to be a pretty fatal flaw because it's so centered on the family.
Well, Mrs. Boynton is a great character. A horrible person, but really interesting character.
Yeah, it's one of, I think there are a few examples in literature that I can think of sadists, like pure sadism. I'm thinking one of the best ones that I've come across being in Shakespeare and Dickens. They're always these very larger than life characters. And I think in more contemporary fiction, this is definitely one of the best examples. It's so well drawn, and to me, very, very believable. Okie dokie, should we get into what should we do next? We probably can't say more about the plot without getting into spoiler territory, or indeed characters. But do you want to talk a bit about the non-family characters? So Sarah King, did you like her? She's meant to be one of our Agatha Christie bright young things. She always draws, doesn't she, these young adventurous women who are well beyond their time in terms of their pluck and their courage. But this is the first one who is genuinely a professional. Like, you've got characters who are sort of minor aristocracy in other books. You've got characters who are sort of have made small inheritances, or who are kind of living on their wits. But this is the first time you've got a properly educated professional woman. Any thoughts on Sarah King and that from that perspective?
Nothing really to add beyond it. I mean, I think beyond what I would say, and again, it's because you've got to have the stamina to follow it through, is you have to realize that a lot of her early information that she's giving us, her point of view, she's almost deluding herself about her attraction. And when we talk about the adaptations, I think we can come back onto this, her attraction towards Raymond Boynton, because it almost means that like we've been with them for an amount of time before she actually admits, that she's romantically interested in Raymond Boynton to herself. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she just thinks she wants to rescue him and do a good deed, I think, or is up for that for a lot of it.
I think I enjoy the sort of the elements of humor that can be brought into a situation by people who are deluding themselves in this sort of way, and I think, I enjoyed the character. She had some quite interesting insights to make, and she made some quite sharp observations. And she's got that great line towards the start about how she's not allowed into mosques with uncovered arms, even though the good
Yeah.
Lord made them. So I think Christie's given her a few great one-liners, which I enjoyed. So
yeah, and I think through that character, you get a lot of. I suspect Agatha Christie is expressing a lot of how she feels about life, because
yes,
Christie was a young woman who travelled the world and just on her own on randomly booked holidays to the Middle East, and was quite sort of plucky, and she was very, to use a contemporary phrase for her time, sex positive. I mean, a lot of her characters are motivated by lust, and she doesn't really see anything wrong with, a strong, healthy appetite in that regard. I think Agatha Christie was just very, very unusually honest and frank about what she thought about life. There's a wonderful line where Sarah King describes breaking off her engagement, which I wonder if that is Agatha reflecting on her own disastrous first marriage. And this is what Sarah King says. She was clear-sighted enough to realize that mere mutual attraction was not a sufficient basis on which to build a lifetime of happiness. And I think, gosh, Agatha Christie had 3 proposals, married Archie Christie because he was so flipping good looking. And then, the attraction wanes and it's a crap marriage. I just thought, wow, that's
well,
pretty.
yeah, but there's a bit that just goes on beyond that, which again might be what Agatha was actually thinking when she wrote it, but again, which didn't quite ring true to me, because I don't understand why 2 people can't be equal in a relationship. And I think Sarah King explains that she thinks like one of the reasons why that relationship broke down is that they were both strong characters and they were clashing with each other, and they both wanted to dominate and be in control. And really, Sarah realized that she probably needed somebody who was going to be a bit more amenable, And I was sort of reading it going, yeah, it's not a great basis for a relationship going forward, Sarah, if you
But it
pick
is
Raymond.
interesting, isn't it? And I
Point.
wonder if it's internalized misogyny, like this idea that if you've been raised, and, Agatha Christie was a Victorian child, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and so she's been raised with certain ideas about how a marriage operates. And her first marriage was a clash, I think, of
Strong characters.
egos, but also who was earning. I mean, ultimately, that marriage broke when she became the breadwinner. And I think a lot of men would find that hard to take, even in contemporary society. And, as whatever they may say. And I think it's fascinating that when she marries for the second time, although Max Mallowan is, incredibly, well regarded in his field, he is younger than her and he's financially dependent on her. So it's almost like, rather than having married someone who couldn't cope with her as an equal, rather than finding a man who could cope with her as an equal, she almost kind of married someone who was financially dependent on her and became kind of the man in the relationship, in a sort of regressive Victorian version of what a marriage is. But then, interestingly, on her passport, whenever she had to write down her profession on an official form, she never put author, she always put housewife. So I think there's a lot of very kind of complicated crap going on with Agatha Christie, both liking kind of financial independence and being in control in a relationship, but also kind of in her heart of hearts wanting maybe a more Victorian version. I think it's very conflicted there.
Possibly, or in just being powerful enough to be able to decide what it was that she would call herself on her passport.
Yeah, exactly.
I can choose to be a housewife.
Giggle at herself,
Yeah.
I may be the best-selling author in the world, but I'll just call myself a housewife.
So anyway, that was me on Dr. Sarah King. I think she's a good character, but I just found the relationship with Raymond, the initial spark, I don't think Christie does enough to convince me as a reader of
I
that.
can see that. I can see that. And he is a thin character. I mean, he's almost deliberately a thin character because he hasn't been allowed to develop by his mother into a sort of fully actuated adult. But yeah, why Sarah would be attracted to that is weird to get your head around.
Yeah, and I think like she makes an attempt. Like Gerard, when he's describing the family, he describes them almost as looking like a Greek god, but it is just one sentence. And I can understand if he was devastatingly good looking, how that initial attraction would be purely physical. I could buy into that. But Christie makes so little of it.
Yeah,
it's just one throwaway sentence, and I don't read anything beyond it. So anyway, it was just an initial hurdle I had to sort of.
Yeah, but it's a big one, and it's a valid one, I think, given the way it's written. The other thing that I thought maybe was more a reflection of Agatha Christie than Sarah King is when Agatha Christie speaks of her attitude to religion. I just thought it was really interesting. She said, or she says through Sarah, I used to think I wasn't anything when asked what her religion is, but now I'm not so sure. I feel that if I could sweep all this away, all the buildings and the sects and the fierce squabbling churches, that I might see Christ's quiet figure riding into Jerusalem on a donkey and believe in him, end quote. I thought that was just like really powerful writing.
Yeah, it's of the time. Like I'm reading it now, and I skipped it. I was like, oh, this just sounds a bit almost ridiculous. I don't need this aspect. This is a bigger, more metaphysical conversation than I think I'm able to have in the sort of time allotted to discuss appointment with death. You know, because
I feel I really enjoyed seeing. It's almost like, Agatha Christie by this point can write a good Hercule murder mystery, not in her sleep. Of course, there's lots of effort, but she's got it down pat. And I find it really, when moments like this kind of spike through almost by accident, when she allows herself to reveal something a little bit more profound and a little bit more interesting.
It's whether I agree with the statement and think that, that I've been given some sort of profound philosophical insight. I don't feel that about that point, but yes, as a statement that maybe we're getting to see what Agatha Christie was thinking herself, and I can certainly see that being in that sort of setting, if she's traveled.
Important because so many of especially like David Suchet, but a lot of the adaptations tend to give Hercule Poirot, or tend to really play into his Catholicism and his morality, his religious morality. And actually, I think in a way it's just oversimplistic. I think Agatha Christie, again, had a very slippery and interesting and sort of complicated relationship with religion and morality, and that people, contemporary adaptations tend to sort of impose much more rigid worldviews on him. So I just thought it was interesting. Like, it's very rare for Agatha Christie to ever say anything about religion. So to have this little kind of spike bit come through, there's actually, I find all that kind of like religious squabbling, which, honestly, the first time I went to Jerusalem, I had exactly the same attitude. You go to the Church of the Holy Cross, and where there's meant to be supposedly the place where Jesus's body was laid when it was taken down from the crucifix. And all you don't have a profound spiritual moment, not that I'm particularly spiritual, but all you see is like all these different lamps above it. And there's about 13 different lamps, which represent each different sect of Christianity. So the Greek Orthodox and the Greek Catholics, and Syrian Orthodox and the Syrian Catholic, and the Armenians and the Russians and the Catholic and the Greek Catholics, which I didn't even know existed, and the whatever. And it's just all, and then they've each got their priests like looking like bodyguards, almost like they're jealously trying to guard their territory. And you do kind of like look at that and think, flipping hell, this has gone so far from this story of quite a humble guy walking into Jerusalem, and that, it's all been sort of corrupted into something bigger. So maybe that sentence stood out to me because it's exactly the reaction I had.
But it's not just that. You've been able to bring a measure of your life experience to that I've not had. So I've not seen it that way. So in a way, you've followed in Agatha Christie's footsteps. So
very deliberately. I mean, I did.
And as a result, she's playing to your part of the audience. But she, they say this about Poirot in the second half. Don't you think you're just a little bit biased, Mr. Poirot? Because everywhere you go and somebody dies, you automatically see a murder.
Yes, exactly.
And I think this is maybe the same with you. Whereas I think I'm unbiased in this situation, never having been to Jerusalem. Like most of Agatha Christie's readers back in the 30s, I think this, it was another phrase that maybe didn't ring true, but I get where you're coming from. And I think like if you were in Jerusalem at the time, or in Jerusalem, and maybe they're taking in the atmosphere, yes, you might well see this, or this would be different if Christ came riding through in a donkey, and maybe I would believe in that sort of situation. Yeah, no, I get what you're saying there.
Cool. Okay, well, let's get into let's wrap up a little bit of stuff before we get into the spoilery section. So onto the Christieverse. We're now getting very layered meta references, aren't we, in these books? This novel does mention some other Hercule Poirot mysteries. So of course we get Colonel Carberry retelling the story of Colonel Racing cards on the table. Sorry. Nadine Boynton seems to know about the solution to Murder on the Orient Express and to ask Poirot about it, which is kind of
And when Poirot says, "How did you find?" When Poirot says, "How did you find out about that?" She skates over it and doesn't say, but obviously somebody on the train has been gossiping. So
exactly. And Miss Pierce comments on the ABC murders because she recognizes Poirot from all the publicity surrounding that. So we get kind of some good references to other works. And then we normally chat a little bit about whether the novel sort of holds up in contemporary, giving contemporary views about sort of race and sex and all sorts of other things. And I actually thought for a novel set in the Middle East, it wasn't too bad. I mean, as you said, there are comments from some of the Arab people about resenting the influx of Jews returning to the region. I suppose what most contemporary people would say is that none of the characters that are Arabs are actually given names or motivations. I mean, it's set in the Middle East, but it doesn't really make any Middle Eastern characters, I guess.
They're not given any sort of agency, are they? So
no. Which is obviously not great. I mean, the one thing I would say is that most of the major characters in this book are women, like Mrs. Boynton, Sarah King, Lady Westholme. A lot of and even Nadine Boynton, who's married into the family. A lot of the very strong characters are the women, and a lot of the weak characters who need rescuing are the men, like Raymond Boynton. And it's kind of interesting to me that Raymond is kind of in the damsel in distress who needs rescuing role in this novel.
And Lennox Boynton, whose wife Nadine is forcing him to get out of it, to snap out of it, and even Jefferson Cope, who is given quite a scathing character appraisal by Dr. Gerard. I felt a bit sorry for Jefferson Cope. I thought here he is trying to do his best and help the family out and help an old friend Nadine out in a difficult situation. And Gerard's just called him overly sentimental and a waste of space. And I thought it's a bit rough. Gerard's like, the only place in the modern world where chivalry still exists, the mind of useless American men. You're like, oh my God.
Exactly.
There's Dr. Gerard and Poirot. I mean, even Colonel Carberry is really he's just the Hastings race substitute, isn't he?
There's very little going on. I suppose one could say that what goes on in the final chapter with the neat tying of bows is probably a little bit kind of regressive insofar as that, there is this awful sense with Agatha Christie that she does rather like, creating these sorts of moments, doesn't she, that are sort of like Papa Poirot likes a happy ending.
Yeah.
But let me.
I did have that again. It sort of reminded me back to when you were talking about the Cards on the Table podcast, and there's that bit where who's the Christie avatar in Cards on the Table?
Ariadne Oliver.
Ariadne Oliver is talking about having to pad novels out, to make sure she gets the word count for the published book. And I just looked at that last chapter and said, all very nice, but this smacks to me of Agatha just needing to make the word count. I mean, I think, this is just me completely reading between the lines. I think if you look at these three books, Murder in Mesopotamia, Death on the Nile, and Our Appointment with Death, I think she's, for me, been writing these at the same time, and she's invested in some of the characters far more than she's invested in others. I think she's obviously taken much more pleasure and much more time in writing Death on the Nile and building the characters up than she has in the others. And she's had a great idea for the plot and the story, and she's sketched the outline pretty quickly. But like this one smacks to me, like it's got moments of brilliance, but it's like this has got to hit a deadline. I just want to get this off my desk now. I'm almost bored with it. I'm gonna wrap it up.
I think it's a bit hard. I think it's definitely not as good as Death on the Nile, but that is one of the all-time greats. But it's not as bad as Murder in Mesopotamia. So I think it's like you say, it's tier 2 Christie, it's a tier 2 Poirot. And I think where something like Death on the Nile has so many characters that are memorable, this, I think for me, it's Mrs. Boynton is the memorable character. And so there's one or two, depending on who your favourites are, but it's not like everyone. Whereas Murder in Mesopotamia, I can barely mention one character that I remember from that book. I think they're just all very, very thin indeed.
Well, just tying this back to how we started it, when you were talking about how it stands up in contemporary society, I think one of the characters who has aged worst in this, and it's unfortunate in a way because when I was reading her, I thought that she could be one of the great sort of dames of English literature. She's almost up there with Lady Catherine de Bourgh from Pride and Prejudice and Lady Bracknell from Importance of Being Earnest was Lady Westholme, where she starts off on this great speech about how, you need to boil tea and how things need to be just done right and polished shoes and stuff like that. But then it descends into a criticism of the Arabs and you're like, oh, it's just,
But
it's
so
lost its,
true of that type of person, right? They often are
yeah.
really like self-important and obnoxious.
But
I think Agatha Christie
they
gets it
come across as
really right.
come across as great entertaining characters,
Mm.
being so self-important and obnoxious. It's always comedic to read, but then there was an element of nastiness to it that it just,
Oh,
again,
absolutely.
switched me off, and I just thought that. So when we're talking about how it holds up, that was one area where I just thought it's not holding up in this area. So,
Mm.
but I did think I really enjoyed the the interview. She gets a lot of stick, Miss Pierce, because she's quite a weedy character. But I thought that they were quite an entertaining double act when they were being interviewed
Absolutely.
by Poirot. So
Absolutely.
it was good fun. That
Yep.
part I
I
enjoyed
agree.
it.
I agree. Okay, so let's get on to the adaptations before we get into the spoiler section. So, I mean, it's interesting to know that this was actually adapted by Agatha Christie for the theatre. And I think I'm right in saying that when she did this, she actually took the opportunity to change the ending, which she often did when she did theatre adaptations. So, I think whenever I'm watching an adaptation of one of her books, which I really don't like, I always think, well, Agatha Christie felt free to do that with her own work, so there's no need for us to get all sniffy about it. But there is a different killer, and there is a different resolution. So if you want to see something very different from Agatha Christie's own hand, you can do that. But there are two kind of TV film adaptations. One is a 1988 film directed by Michael Winner, of all people. It was the final one that starred Peter Ustinov as Hercule Poirot. It's all in Jerusalem because the funding for the film was by some Israeli guy, and that was kind of like part of the deal, I think, of doing it. So, but the cast is insane, right? It's Peter Ustinov, as I said, as Hercule Poirot. Lauren Bacall is Lady Westholme. Carrie Fisher is Nadine Boynton. So John Gielgud is Colonel Carberry. Piper Laurie is Mrs. Boynton, I think, previewing her role in Twin Peaks. Hayley Mills is Miss Quinton. Jenny Seagrave is Sarah King. David Soul is Jefferson Cope. I mean, it's just like a nuts cast.
Yeah.
Have you seen this version?
I rewatched bits of it recently, sort of like flicking through it, not in sort of detail, but I would say a couple of things stood out to me on this that I thought were quite interesting. I thought they made more of the relationship between Raymond and Sarah King. He has a couple of flamboyant flourishes to try and get her attention. And I bought into that. I was like, right, now I can see it. And I do think there's a backstory alluded to it in the book about them having met on the train. We missed that conversation, or we missed that bit. And I think maybe more should be made of that if you're doing an adaptation to try and get more buy-in. And I think it was also we're not talking about the Suchet version at the moment, but they did that in there as well. They make more of that first meeting to try and explain why this couple are attracted to each other.
Yeah, I agree.
It's missing from the book. So
I did quite enjoy it. I mean, I do quite like the Peter Ustinov versions. I mean, I don't think it's an amazing adaptation, but
no,
you can find it on YouTube, so it's worth if you're into this.
And Gielgud is not Agatha Christie's Carberry.
No.
By any stretch, he's John Gielgud playing John Gielgud, just in the same way that Ustinov is playing himself. There's no way he's the Colonel Carberry of Appointment with Death, the book.
Quite agree. And then the next adaptation, or the second adaptation, is part of that David Suchet ITV Agatha Christie's Poirot, and it comes fairly late on in the run. So I think it was around 2008 it came out. It's very different, very different. So Mrs. Boynton's husband, who in the book is deceased, is alive and well, and played by Tim Curry of all peoples, which is hilarious.
And an archaeologist, not a prison governor.
Yeah, an archaeologist. We've got John Hannah plays Dr. Gerard, and Elizabeth McGovern is Lady Westholme. And the kind of motivation for them to be near the family is very different. There's a random Polish nun who's a white slaver. I mean, it's all Lennox Boynton and Jefferson Cope are the same person. There's no Nadine, there's no Miss Pierce. It's just, I don't think it's bad. I mean, I've watched it and I think it's fine as far as it goes, and it's a good cast, but it's just slightly gonzo and bonkers, particularly the Tim Curry character. And I just couldn't really take it seriously, I guess. I think this is one of my least favorite of the Suchet adaptations.
I again rewatched it recently, and I again flicked through bits I wasn't enjoying, but a couple of bits I've already mentioned the Raymond Boynton Sarah King relationship. Like there's a bit where she's in one of a souk or something in Jerusalem, and I don't know if she's assaulted or falls down or whatever, but he almost turns up, at the same time, and you can see the attachment start there, and you think, oh, right, okay, I get that. The other thing that I really liked was, and they built quite a bit around this, was the explanation of the title, because that's not in the book. And I thought it was a nice little touch, and I liked a little bit of folklore that they had around it about the guy and the punchline. The guy was in Damascus and he saw death, and so he rode 40 miles out into the desert to try and escape death, and he met death at the oasis that he'd ridden to, and death goes, yeah, I'm surprised to see you here, because when I saw you in Damascus and we didn't have an appointment, our appointment was here, and that's when the guy died. And I thought, oh, what a nice little bit of folklore to just throw in there, but completely missing from Agatha's book. So I thought, yeah, they've done well to sort of expand on that aspect of it and make something of it.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I thought was interesting as well, because I did think this one was a lot more gothic. It had much more, and Mark Gatiss was involved.
Yes.
As a sort of stepson, and I thought, I wonder if he had any influence on the way this has been portrayed.
Tim Curry and Mark Gatiss on screen together, just absolutely fantastic. And Mark Gatiss, interestingly, had a very small part in the latest Mission Impossible film. So there you go. Okay,
well, we're not doing that. I know you put a call to arms out for that, so I'll wait to listen to that podcast. But I'm not a big MI fan. So
I wasn't up until last week. So basically, I had stopped watching them after MI2 because I thought that was so terrible. But my husband's a big fan, so we got tickets to watch it on Friday, and he said you should really watch them. So we ended up watching one a night, and I actually became quite a fan of them, watching them in that very condensed way.
Great.
Yeah.
I look forward to the podcast.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd want to cover in the spoiler-free bit?
I don't think so. I think we've covered pretty much everything we've talked about. I mean, there's a lot more to go into on the characters, but like you said, that's probably touched on the spoilers. On the sort of the general opening points, I think I've covered everything. Like I said, I think the most interesting part of that was this Emirate of Transjordan. It was quite interesting to get an insight into that world. And now we've talked about the second part of it being very atmospheric. So yeah, no, I'm good. I'm good with everything.
Very good. Okay, listener. Well, I'm not sure if we have inspired you to read Appointment with Death. I probably think it's more compelling than Pat does, but it's definitely, it's not Death on the Nile, but I think it's a worthy part of her Middle East trilogy, if you want to put it that way. If you do want to hear what we have to say about it with spoilers, stay tuned to after the end credits music. Otherwise, join us next time when, rather out of season, we'll be discussing Hercules Poirot's Christmas. Until then, I hope you have fun whatever you're reading, and speak to you next time. Okay, so let's get into the solution of this book. So the first major clue is the means of the murder, which is injecting with digitoxin. And although it's a massive misdirect, because Agatha Christie has led you to believe that it's the family that have the real motivation to kill the mother, and actually members of the family all believe that the other people did in trying to cover up for them. But actually, we should know it's not a family member, because any of the family members would have had the opportunity to mess with her medicine, and they wouldn't have had to need to resort to using the hypodermic needle. So then you have to look outside of the family. And we are then given another piece of very important evidence, which is that Miss Pierce can be very easily misdirected to remember things that didn't happen by the domineering personality of Lady Westholme. And also that Lady Westholme suddenly appears to have bionic vision when she describes the very kind of badly wrapped and dirty puttees of the Arab man talking to Mrs. Boynton, which she couldn't possibly have seen that detail from the distance she was observing from. And then the final clue is that when Mrs. Boynton was apparently being very mean to Sarah King, she wasn't even really looking at her. And she said the phrase, "I never forget a face. I never forget a person." And it's obviously being said to Sarah, but really being intended for someone else. And all of that leads us to realize that the murderer is actually Lady Westholme, that before she was married into the British aristocracy, she was a prisoner in a jail that Mrs. Boynton was the prison warden of, and that Mrs. Boynton, having become rather bored with the easy game of dominating her family, is looking for someone new to dominate and to be sadistic over. And she has told Lady Westholme that she's recognized her, and that Lady Westholme, to prevent being blackmailed, takes action and kills her instead. So that's the solution to the plot, is basically it is Lady Westholme. How did you find the mechanics of the plot, and how satisfying did you find the technique of creating that murder mystery and the solution that was presented, Pat?
Well, just coming back to it being sort of like in three parts, I've already explained why I didn't like the way the stage, or didn't enjoy the way the stage was set as much as I've enjoyed other Christies. But I think everything else was well done. I think like the mechanics of the murder, how Christie has told that part of it was good. I really enjoyed the third part where Poirot is interviewing them all individually and picking holes in their stories, and it's been pieced together that none of them have actually committed the murder, but they've all been lying because they all believe somebody else has, and they're all trying to cover up for each other. And I thought it was a great touch with Sarah King, and it made me like her more as a character, because I'd been quite put off with her, being attracted to this rather nondescript guy, Raymond Boynton, at the start. But there's this bit where Poirot tests her professional pride, like she's newly qualified, and he questions her over the time of death. And she's like, no, the corpse was absolutely dead for a minimum of 2 hours. But every member of the Boynton family has turned around and said, we spoke to her, 40 minutes ago or an hour ago. And Poirot knows that, according to Sarah King, Mrs. Boynton was already dead. And Sarah King, even though she quite likes Raymond Boynton and she doesn't want to see the Boynton family go through any more hardship, and she's actually turned around to Poirot and Gerard and gone, why don't you just drop this and let it go? But when it comes to her professional pride, no, she's adamant. She's not going to turn around and change her story. She's not going to say, oh, well, maybe I was wrong and maybe it was only half an hour. She's like, no, Mrs. Boynton was dead when everybody was talking to her. So, I'm not backing down on that point. So I quite liked the way that all these jigsaw puzzle pieces were dropped in. I thought that worked quite well.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a really ingenious misdirect on the part of Agatha Christie to focus us on the family and then to have it to be outside of the family. And I think part of what you were saying about Lady Westholme being really unpleasant and sort of high-handed about the Arabs, I think is meant to alert us to the fact that she is quite a nasty character as well. Like, the book's so dominated by the really nasty character of Mrs. Boynton, but also that Lady Westholme is pretty horrific and self-centered and self-serving, and that this is a nasty character, a very self-important character. And the way in which she sort of domineers Miss Pierce is like a shadow version of how Mrs. Boynton domineers her family. And so we should also have our guard up about Lady Westholme.
I think you're right. And I'm disappointed in a way, because I think she could have been a character like Lady Catherine de Bourgh or Lady Bracknell. I could have had a lot of affection for and been more comedic. But Poirot points this out to her, during the interview with her and Miss Pierce. And he turns around and says, I think you would be somebody who would find it quite easy to drop inconvenient travelling companions, Lady Westholme.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's some great humour around it. I think that there's another one of Christie's great phrases where she turns around. I almost felt like I was reading Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because she's like, Lady Westholme met Lord Westholme on a ship travelling from America, and the world found yet another reason not to travel, or she says something like that.
To beware of cruise travel.
Yeah, the hazards of cruise travel.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It is really hilarious.
I thought, what a great turn of phrase. I thought it was like really funny. So,
and it's great because she's just this pompous ass, but actually she's really dangerous under the surface, and I think it does pull the rug out from under us, I think, a little bit. Yeah. So I really do like the sort of the resolution of it. I like the idea that Dr. Gerard understands and explains to us that for a true sadist, Mrs. Boynton has lost the pleasure. She's lost the pleasure of dominating people who were so easily domineered.
Yeah.
And I like the way that he gets that Mrs. Boynton would have cleverly introduced Nadine Boynton when she realized that Lennox was coming of age and needed to basically get his rocks off. So let me control the situation and introduce the women to him. But the idea of why would someone like that want to travel? She's obese. She finds it hard to move around. Why would she want to take this holiday? Because she wants to find a new victim. And then why would she send them all off on the walk? That's the other big clue. Because she wants to have her rendezvous with Lady Westholme. And Sarah King's smart, so she gets that there's something weird about this freedom, but she also wants to use it, right? I think that's all very cleverly laid down.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Gerard is very important as a character from that point of view, because he gets three key pieces of sort of like narration where he's basically giving the reader information.
Yes.
So there's the bit where he, in the first or second part when they're at Petra, I can't remember where, the first part when they're in the Solomon Hotel, he's talking to Sarah King and he explains the family dynamic as he sees it to her. And he said, look, she is at the center of everything. She's a sadist. She's enjoying doing this and controlling the family. And as a result, the children are all emotionally stunted.
Yes, exactly.
And then there's the bit then where after when Poirot's interviewing them all, and again, he's leading us through the family dynamic. He explains basically what's going on for the reader in case you couldn't put the pieces together. And I think that's really important because it's interesting and it keeps you engaged in the book. I think it was one of the things that meant that I could finish the book. It pulled me back in.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, I think you're right. I think it's a book that gets stronger and stronger because you get the complexity of the psychology of what's happening with
and that family dynamic, which
absolutely.
is important.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of the book, right? I mean, it pretty much is everything. I mean, some people have accused it of not quite playing fair, the idea that to make that leap to know that Lady Westholme had been a prisoner. And Hercule Poirot kind of has to make that leap too and hope it comes off. But I think actually, based on, if you believe the psychology, and because for many, many novels, we've been told that Hercule Poirot is someone who finds motive through psychology. Therefore, this approach to it makes sense. But you've got to have all those novels leading up to this point because the deduction is purely through that, right? It's purely through what would a sadist like Mrs. Boynton need? Why would she take the holiday? Therefore, what is the kind of person she'd be up against? And also by laying in that character of Lady Westholme, that ruthlessness and that self-centeredness to commit an audacious murder. So I think it's a cleverer book. When I read it again, I do think it's second tier, but I think actually in the psychology it is quite clever. And I think the final sort of third is very good indeed.
Yeah, because again, like we're talking about Poirot, I never have any problems believing that Poirot's figured these things out just through the use of his little grey cells. You know, I've always bought into the fact that he's just an exceptionally intelligent, great, has great powers of deduction. And with this as well, I think it's quite interesting at the start where he's talking to Colonel Carberry about the very beginning of it. And Carberry's saying, I'd like you to look into this for me. I need it all tidying up so I understand what's going on. And Poirot says, just as long as we define the boundaries of what can and can't be achieved here, I will give you the truth, but you can't take this to a court of law and expect a conviction because I won't necessarily have any evidence, but I can explain to you. And when he rounds them all up and explains to them all how he sees it as happening, Lady Westholme's not in the room, but he makes sure that she can hear him.
Which is also brilliant psychology because he knows it's going to neatly resolve the issue, the tedious issue of taking it to court.
But yeah, exactly. But more than that, if he's actually proven to be wrong, it's not there's no danger here. All he's doing is explaining his supposition as he sees it. And if for some reason the rug was pulled out from him underneath, as he's doing the explanation, if there was some reason why it didn't work out, it's not a problem. I see he's taking a gamble and it's paid off because he's that convinced of his own abilities. But it's not to say that he might not have been wrong. I mean, apart from the fact it's Poirot and he's never wrong, but he's he's taking a punt, in a low risk situation. So I don't have any problem buying into the way he's deduced this. I think that's I can accept that.
I agree. Well, that's a good note, maybe upon which to end, unless there's anything else you want to.
I'm going to do my Poirot being Poirot bit.
Go on then.
A couple more for Xander, if he ever makes it this far into one of these podcasts that we're doing. There's a couple of bits. So the first one is where Carberry and Gerard are talking to him just at the beginning of that third part, and Carberry is asking him if he can give it to him, and Poirot says, yes, I'll give you the truth and all the details about how it happened. And Carberry and Gerard look back at him incredulously, and Poirot goes, I am gifted, said the little man, modestly. And then there's another bit where he first meets Ginevra Boynton. And Ginevra's like, I thought this was actually a really interesting part, was how Gerard compared Ginevra and her mother and said they both had the same sort of psychological makeup. They had a need to be famous.
We're going to channel it healthily into the theatre.
Yeah, but they had a need to be successful. And Sarah King goes, oh, but Mrs. Boynton's not been successful. And Gerard's like, oh, no, she has been. She's defined the terms of her own success, and she has complete control of the world that she's created. So I thought that was quite interesting. But anyway, Ginevra Boynton goes, you're a detective, aren't you? And Poirot goes, yes, mademoiselle. And Ginevra goes, a very well-known detective? And Poirot goes, the best detective in the world. He said, stating it as a simple truth, no more or no less. And I thought, that's him, just nailed on the spot. So
yeah, absolutely fantastic. I think I really love Poirot. I just think he's so in a way self-aware. Like, there's no hypocrisy in him thinking himself smart, because he kind of is. But he's like you say, he lays it out for Carberry. This is what I can achieve. This is what I can't. Like, there's no kind of. He is still very good at sort of circumscribing exactly what he does and what he doesn't do. I think there's a lot that's kind of, and as Hannah says, I always like it when there's no Hastings, because I just think that brings out the worst in him. Like, he's actually just much more straightforward and much nicer when Hastings isn't around to bully.
A lot less condescending.
And I did wonder if a little bit the Lady Westholme and Miss Peirce is like, Agatha Christie, like a bit of a comment on the worst of Poirot and Hastings. He's much better off not having a sidekick around, for sure.
Poor Hastings.
Poor Hastings. Alas, poor Hastings, but he'll be back. All right, listener. Well, hopefully you enjoyed our discussion of Appointment with Death and agreed or disagreed with our take. Feel free to jump on our Discord. If you search for Vassals of Kingsgrave or VOK podcast, you will come across us, so you can join in the fun. As we said before, our next read will be Hercules Poirot's Christmas, which may be a mini pod or a full pod, depending on who's around. Then we're into a good run. We've got Murder is Easy and the amazing, sublime, iconic, horrifying, and Then There Were None. So we're into the really amazing phase of Agatha Christie's career. Thank you for joining, and we'll speak to you next time. Bye.
Okay, bye.